My name is Nora, 33 years old, and my husband thought he held all the power in our marriage. At 2 in the morning, he swaggered into our kitchen, reeking of expensive Cabernet and a sickeningly sweet floral perfume that definitely was not mine. He slammed a stack of pre-signed divorce papers onto the marble island. He leaned in close, a cruel smirk playing on his lips, and whispered that he did not come home last night, and he did not regret a single second of it. He expected me to scream, to cry, to shatter into a million pieces. Instead, I calmly swallowed the last bite of my Caesar salad, took his pen, signed the papers without reading a single line, and went to sleep. The next morning, he woke up expecting a tearful apology, only to find his reality completely dismantled. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart someone who severely underestimated your intelligence. The air in the house was thick and heavy that night. I had been sitting at the kitchen island for hours, my laptop glowing in the dim light. To Derek, my husband of 5 years, I was just his boring wife who did freelance bookkeeping from home to pass the time. He was a 35-year-old chief executive officer of a booming real estate technology startup, currently preparing for a massive venture capital funding round. He thought he was a king, and he treated me like a peasant who should be grateful just to live in his castle. He had no idea that my quiet little bookkeeping business was a carefully constructed front. I was actually an elite independent forensic accountant, and I had spent the entire last year secretly tracing his dark money and fraudulent company accounts. When the front door finally clicked open at 2 in the morning, I did not even look up from my screen. I heard his heavy, uncoordinated footsteps echo across the hardwood floor. He walked into the kitchen, his tie completely undone, his expensive dress shirt wrinkled and stained. The stench of alcohol and another woman hit me like a physical blow. He tossed his keys onto the counter with a loud, aggressive clatter. He stood there for a moment, waiting for me to ask where he had been, or who he had been with, when I remained completely silent. Staring at my spreadsheets, he reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick manila envelope and slapped it down onto the smooth marble right next to my salad bowl. He pulled out the legal documents already signed by him on the bottom line and pushed them toward me. His eyes were cold, filled with a twisted sense of superiority. He told me he was done playing house with a woman who had no ambition and brought nothing to the table. He bragged about his night out, making sure his words were as cruel and humiliating as possible. He wanted a massive reaction. He fed on drama and control, and he was starving for me to give him an ego boost by breaking down and begging him to stay. I looked down at the harsh black ink on the documents. I looked up at his flushed, arrogant face. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over my mind. I did not shed a single tear. I picked up my fork, speared a crisp piece of romaine lettuce, and chewed it slowly. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, becoming deeply uncomfortable for him. I swallowed, wiped my mouth carefully with a linen napkin, and picked up the heavy gold pen he had deliberately placed on top of the papers to force my hand. I flipped directly to the last page. I did not read the terms of the divorce. I already knew what a greedy narcissist like Derek would demand. He would try to take the house, the cars, and leave me with pennies. I signed my name with a smooth, practiced stroke. I slid the papers back across the counter, stood up, and picked up my bowl. I walked to the sink, rinsed it, and placed it in the dishwasher. I dried my hands, walked right past his stunned open mouth, and headed upstairs to the guest bedroom. I locked the door, laid down in the dark, and fell asleep within minutes. The sun rose bright and harsh a few hours later. It was 7 in the morning. I was already awake, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit, holding a fresh cup of black coffee. I stood near the front door, waiting in total silence. I heard the heavy thud of Derek coming down the main staircase. He was stomping his feet, clearly agitated and ready for a fight. He expected the initial shock to have worn off. He fully expected to find me in the kitchen crying, having prepared his morning espresso, ready to negotiate my meager existence and beg for his financial mercy. He rounded the corner, adjusting his expensive Italian silk tie, already barking orders at me. He told me we needed to discuss logistics immediately, and that I had to find a cheap apartment by the end of the month. Then his voice caught in his throat. He stopped dead in his tracks. Right next to the heavy oak front door sat 3 large black industrial garbage bags bulging at the seams. Beside them were his 2 vintage leather suitcases hastily zipped shut. I took a slow sip of my coffee, looking him dead in the eye. I told him he wanted an exit strategy, and I was simply facilitating his departure. Derek stared at the black garbage bags, his face turning a mottled shade of red. He let out a harsh barking laugh, grabbing the handles of his leather suitcases. He told me I was being overly dramatic, and that I would be begging him to come back by Friday when the mortgage was due. He kicked the screen door open and marched down the driveway toward his pristine white Tesla Model S. It was his pride and joy, a vehicle he bought supposedly as a company expense, but registered under a complex personal arrangement he thought kept it safe from any marital disputes. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen aggressively to unlock the doors. Nothing happened. He tapped it again, swearing under his breath. He swiped closed the application, restarted his phone, and yanked on the sleek silver door handle. The car remained dead silent and firmly locked. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool morning air biting at my cheeks. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast. I watched him struggle for a full minute, enjoying the sight of his growing frustration before I finally spoke. I raised my voice just enough to carry over the quiet suburban street, informing him that he was locked out because I had completely revoked his digital access. He spun around, his eyes wide with fury. He shouted that it was his car, paid for by his company, and demanded I unlock it instantly. I smiled gently and reminded him of the tax paperwork I filed for him last spring. The paperwork he was always too busy to read, claiming financial details were beneath his pay grade. To supposedly maximize his deductions, I had structured the lease so that the vehicle was legally registered entirely under my name. If he somehow managed to hotwire it or break a window to get inside, I assured him I would immediately dial the police and report the vehicle stolen. I reminded him that a grand theft auto charge would not look very good to his venture capital investors right before his massive funding round. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He dropped his hand from the car door, his chest heaving as his mind scrambled for a solution. He pointed a finger at me, spitting out that I was a crazy, vindictive woman, but it did not matter. He said he did not need my little games and he would simply take a luxury car service to his office and have his legal team rip me apart by noon. He pulled his phone back up, his thumbs flying across the screen to order a premium black car. I leaned against the wooden railing of the porch, waiting for the inevitable notification. 10 seconds later, a loud negative chime echoed from his phone speaker. Payment declined. He scowled, pulling out his designer leather wallet. He retrieved his heavy metal platinum credit card, the one he proudly slapped down at expensive steakhouses to impress his colleagues and intimidate waiters. He typed the numbers manually into the application. Another negative chime rang out. He tried his secondary corporate card. Declined again. He looked up at me, genuine confusion finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He demanded to know what I had done to his accounts. I took another measured sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch. I explained that he had always treated my freelance bookkeeping business like a cute little hobby, something to keep my tiny brain occupied while he did the real work of building an empire. Because he never paid attention, he never noticed that the joint checking account he insisted on opening to control my spending was actually set up with me as the primary account holder. That heavy metal platinum card he loved to show off was merely an authorized user card tied directly to my personal accounts. I had frozen every single card in his wallet at exactly 2:15 in the morning. Furthermore, his corporate accounts were currently undergoing a routine security audit, a process I had triggered anonymously using my professional credentials long before he even walked through the door last night. He had absolutely zero access to liquid cash. He could not buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a high-powered attorney to intimidate me. The vein in his forehead throbbed visibly. The sophisticated, untouchable chief executive officer persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate cornered bully who realized he had lost control. He let out a guttural scream, dropped his expensive smartphone right onto the concrete driveway, and charged toward the porch. His fists were clenched tight, his eyes dark with sudden violent intent. He crossed the distance in seconds, taking the porch steps two at a time, lunging directly at my throat to physically force me into submission. I did not step back. I did not even flinch. Just as his hands reached out to grab me, the heavy oak door behind me swung open with a massive thud. Two towering private security guards, each built like a tank and wearing tactical black gear, stepped out from the kitchen. The first guard effortlessly caught Derek by the wrist, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him face first into one of the thick wooden pillars of the porch. The impact knocked the wind completely out of him. He gasped, his cheek pressed hard against the painted wood, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sudden sharp pain. The second guard, equally imposing, stepped down from the doorway and calmly positioned himself on Derek's other side. Derek struggled, trying to wrench his arm free, shouting threats about lawsuits and assault charges. The guard simply applied a fraction more pressure to his wrist, forcing a sharp yelp from the so-called untouchable chief executive officer. I took another sip of my coffee, completely unbothered by the physical scuffle happening on my front porch. I reached over to the small patio table where I had placed the thick manila envelope he had so arrogantly slapped onto the kitchen island just 5 hours ago. I pulled out the divorce papers, the very same documents his expensive and ruthless lawyers had drafted to leave me with absolutely nothing. I walked down the steps, stopping just a few feet from where he was pinned. I held up page 12, tapping my fingernail against a specific heavily bolded paragraph. I read the clause out loud to him. It clearly stated that upon the execution of this document, the party who does not hold the legal deed to the primary residence must vacate the premises immediately, relinquishing all keys, security codes, and access rights, without the need for a formal court-ordered eviction notice. Derek spat out a harsh laugh, his face still squished against the pillar. He yelled that he transferred the mortgage payments from his company accounts, so he owned the house, meaning I was the one who had to pack my bags and leave. I smiled a genuine and warm smile. I gently corrected his profound misunderstanding of his own finances. I reminded him that while he blindly transferred money into the joint account every month to play the role of the big provider, the actual legal deed to the property was purchased and held by a private trust. A trust that I had meticulously set up, and of which I was the sole legal beneficiary. His name was nowhere on the deed, the title, or the county property tax records. By aggressively demanding a fast, brutal divorce and pre-signing those papers to intimidate me, he had legally and permanently evicted himself from my property. The color completely drained from his face as the realization finally set in. The legal trap he had paid his lawyers to dig for me was the exact same grave he had just buried himself in. I gave a brief dismissive nod to the security guards. They immediately hoisted Derek up by his armpits. They did not give him a single moment to argue or resist. They marched him forcefully down the porch steps and down the long concrete driveway. The second guard casually picked up the 3 black garbage bags and the 2 leather suitcases, tossing them unceremoniously toward the curb. As they dragged him toward the street, Derek completely lost whatever shred of dignity he had left. His sophisticated persona shattered, replaced by the screaming tantrums of a fragile narcissist. He thrashed against the massive guards, shouting at the top of his lungs, not caring that the neighbors were definitely peeking through their blinds to watch the morning show. He screamed that I was absolutely nothing without him. He yelled that he built me from the ground up, that he personally rescued me from that dead-end corporate accounting job a year ago. He shouted that if it were not for his extreme generosity and his massive financial success, I would still be rotting in a miserable cubicle working myself to the bone for a pathetic middle-class salary. He called me an ungrateful parasite, claiming he gave me a life of pure luxury, and this humiliating ambush was how I repaid his grace. I stood on the porch watching his public meltdown with cold satisfaction. He truly believed his own lies. He genuinely thought I quit my high-level corporate job to be his kept obedient housewife. He had no idea I left that firm to become an independent forensic accountant, specifically to dismantle his fraudulent empire piece by piece. The guards finally released him, shoving him slightly so he stumbled past the property line and onto the public sidewalk. They stood shoulder to shoulder at the edge of the driveway, forming a silent and impassable wall of muscle. Derek scrambled to his feet, his designer suit wrinkled and covered in driveway dust. He frantically grabbed his cracked smartphone from the concrete. His hands were shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. He unlocked the shattered screen and dialed a number, holding the phone to his ear as he glared daggers at me from the street. I could hear his voice carrying over the quiet morning breeze, dripping with venom and desperation. He told Sienna that his crazy ex-wife had just made the biggest mistake of her miserable life. He paced back and forth on the sidewalk, making a loud, arrogant promise to his mistress. He swore to her that he was going to completely crush me, destroy my reputation, and have this entire house back in his possession by Friday. After shouting his empty threats into the phone on the sidewalk, Derek managed to flag down a passing city cab. His credit cards were completely useless, so he had to beg the driver to take him downtown, promising to pay in cash from a secret emergency fund he kept stashed in his briefcase. He finally arrived at the sleek, ultra-modern lobby of his real estate technology startup. The office was exactly what you would expect from an overfunded, arrogant tech company. There were massive glass walls, polished concrete floors, cold brew on tap, and a giant neon sign displaying the company logo. He marched past the rows of standing desks, ignoring the confused looks of his employees, and aggressively pushed open the heavy glass door to his corner office. Waiting for him inside was Sienna. She was 28 years old, recently promoted to vice president of marketing and fiercely ambitious. She was lounging in his expensive ergonomic office chair, her bare legs draped casually over the armrest. She was wearing nothing but the oversized blue button-down dress shirt he had left on her bedroom floor the night before. She was sipping a green detox juice, looking completely unbothered by the chaos she had helped create. She smirked as Derek slammed his leather briefcase onto the desk, his face red, his chest heaving with exertion and rage. Derek paced the floor like a caged animal, recounting the humiliating eviction in excruciating detail. He told her how his own private security guards had thrown him off the porch, and how his Tesla application was permanently locked. He pounded his fist against the sleek glass desk, swearing that he would destroy me and take back every single penny he claimed he was owed. Sienna just watched him, her eyes calculating and cold. She set her juice down, walked over to him, and placed a manicured hand flat against his chest. She told him to stop whining about a suburban house when millions of dollars were on the line. Sienna forcefully reminded him of the upcoming Series B venture capital funding round and their aggressive plan to take the company public. She pointed out a massive, glaring problem they had completely ignored. When they first started the company, Derek had given me a 15% equity stake because I had handled all the initial financial and tax filings for free. Sienna told him that once the company went public, that 15% would be worth tens of millions of dollars. They could not let a plain, boring housewife walk away with a fortune she did not earn. She insisted they needed to dilute my shares or force me to sign them over entirely to her name before the investors started looking too closely at the cap table. Derek, still blinded by his bruised ego, wanted to march right back to my house with the local police. Sienna grabbed his arm and stopped him. She told him that going back would just trigger a restraining order or cause a public domestic scene that their wealthy investors might hear about. She smiled a wicked, predatory smile and told him to use his greatest weapon instead: his family. Sienna knew exactly how much Derek's mother Beatrice and his sister Claire despised me. Sienna suggested they send the family to ambush me. She told Derek to let his mother break me down emotionally, to scream at me until I felt small and terrified, and then hit me with aggressive legal threats until I signed away the house and the company equity just to make the nightmares stop. While they were busy plotting my emotional destruction in a glass office downtown, I was sitting comfortably on my velvet living room sofa. The house was perfectly quiet. I had just finished compiling a massive, heavily encrypted file for my federal contacts detailing 3 specific offshore accounts Derek had tried to hide under his startup's umbrella. I closed my laptop, stretching my arms with a profound sense of peace. The garbage bags were long gone from the curb, and the air in my home finally felt clean and entirely mine. Suddenly, the sharp chime of the front doorbell shattered the silence. I did not get up immediately. I casually picked up my tablet from the coffee table and opened the high-definition security camera feed. Standing on my front porch was my mother-in-law, Beatrice, her face twisted in a vicious, judgmental scowl. Right next to her was my sister-in-law, Claire, crossing her arms and glaring impatiently at the solid oak door. But they did not come alone. Standing slightly behind them, holding a thick leather briefcase and wearing a sharp custom-tailored suit, was Claire's husband, Kendrick. He was an incredibly sharp African-American corporate lawyer, known for aggressively destroying his opponents in the courtroom, and the cold expression on his face told me they were not here to negotiate. I watched the high-definition security feed for a few seconds longer, taking in the sheer audacity of their unannounced visit. I did not panic, and I certainly did not hide. I simply reached over to the control panel, pressed the intercom button, and remotely unlocked the heavy front door. I walked from the living room into the grand foyer just as Beatrice pushed her way inside. She did not even bother to wipe her designer shoes on the welcome mat. She marched in as if she owned the place, her chin held high, her eyes scanning my home with absolute disdain. Claire followed closely behind her, practically vibrating with nervous, petty energy. Kendrick stepped in last, quietly closing the door behind him. His face was completely unreadable, wearing the perfect mask of a high-powered corporate attorney preparing to execute a hostile takedown. Before I could even offer them a seat, Beatrice launched her verbal assault. She stood in the center of the foyer, crossing her arms over her expensive cashmere coat. She spat her words out, claiming that Derek had called her in tears, completely devastated by my unhinged behavior. She marched right up to me, pointing a manicured finger directly in my face. She said she always knew my poverty-stricken background would eventually show its true colors. She reminded me for the 100th time since our wedding day that I was nothing but a middle-class nobody who did basic math for small businesses, trying to leech off her son's brilliant mind and massive fortune. She then demanded I take off my wedding ring right then and there. She called it a precious family heirloom, even though I knew for a fact Derek had bought it at a commercial jeweler in the mall. She insisted I hand it over immediately to compensate Derek for the 5 years of youth he wasted on a woman who contributed absolutely nothing to his success. I simply stared at her, letting the silence stretch. My lack of a dramatic reaction only infuriated her more. She raised her voice, her face turning red, threatening to call the authorities if I did not start packing my bags. While Beatrice was screaming, Claire was busy snooping around my living room. She was always greedy, constantly trying to take things that did not belong to her. She spotted a tall hand-painted ceramic vase resting on an antique side table. It was a rare piece I had purchased myself during a solo trip to Italy long before Derek ever started making real money. Claire marched over her eyes, gleaming with entitlement, and grabbed it heavily by the neck. She loudly declared that the vase belonged to the family, claiming Derek had bought it for their mother, and that I had maliciously stolen it for my own house. She hugged it tight to her chest, acting as if she was rescuing a hostage from an enemy compound. I watched the two of them perform their chaotic emotional circus. It was almost comical how predictable they were. Derek and Sienna had clearly wound them up and pointed them in my direction, hoping to break my spirit through sheer volume and intimidation. I did not raise my voice to match theirs. I turned my back on Beatrice, walked smoothly into the kitchen, and pulled a crystal glass from the cabinet. I filled it with iced water from the refrigerator dispenser, the soft hum of the machine cutting through the lingering echoes of Beatrice's shouting. I took a slow, refreshing sip, leaning casually against the kitchen island. I looked directly at Claire and told her that if she dropped my Italian vase, I would add its fully appraised value to the massive bill her brother was about to owe me. Claire froze, glaring at me defensively. Beatrice gasped dramatically, utterly offended by my calm defiance. She turned to Kendrick, demanding he do something to put me in my place right this second. Up until this moment, Kendrick had been standing silently near the doorway, observing the entire scene with sharp, calculating eyes. He was not prone to emotional outbursts like his wife and mother-in-law. He was a man of the law, a highly pragmatic predator who relied on binding contracts and legal loopholes to destroy his opponents. Kendrick finally moved. He walked past Beatrice and Claire with measured, confident strides. He approached the kitchen island where I was standing. He did not yell or hurl petty insults. Instead, he lifted his heavy, genuine leather briefcase and slammed it down onto the marble countertop with a loud, resounding crack. The noise echoed through the open floor plan, instantly silencing Beatrice and Claire. Kendrick unlatched the briefcase, his eyes locked onto mine with a cold, professional intensity. He spoke in a deep, authoritative voice, declaring that my little charade was officially over. He stated firmly that by locking Derek out of the primary residence, I was in direct violation of our legally binding prenuptial agreement, and he was here to ensure I left the property with absolutely nothing. Kendrick possessed a voice that was smooth, polished, and meticulously designed to inspire absolute panic. He did not yell like Beatrice or whine like Claire. He utilized the chilling, detached tone of a man who destroyed lives for a living. He leaned over the marble kitchen island, resting his fingertips lightly on the surface, and began to list the severe legal consequences of my actions. He cited specific clauses from the prenuptial agreement, rattling off complex legal statutes regarding marital property breach of fiduciary duty and unlawful detainment. He argued that because Derek had been blindly depositing funds into our joint account to supposedly cover the mortgage and maintenance, the house was legally subject to equitable distribution. He threatened me with an emergency ex parte hearing. He promised to have a judge freeze every single bank account associated with my name by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He painted a bleak, terrifying picture of my immediate future, telling me I would be buried under a massive mountain of legal fees, held in contempt of court, and ultimately thrown out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back to pay for his hourly rate. Beatrice stood behind him, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across her face. She nodded along enthusiastically with every legal threat, clearly enjoying the brutal show. Claire looked equally thrilled, already eyeing my Italian ceramic vase again, as if it were a guaranteed prize she had just won. They fully expected me to break down crying, to apologize profusely, and to beg for mercy from the high-powered lawyer they had brought to crush me. Instead, I simply picked up my glass of iced water and took another slow, deliberate sip. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the heavy weight of Kendrick's threats to hang uselessly in the air. When I finally set the crystal glass down, I did not look scared. I looked utterly bored. I told Kendrick that his grasp of family law was certainly impressive, but his understanding of corporate asset protection was severely lacking. I walked over to the far end of the kitchen island where I had left my laptop. I flipped the screen open, the soft white light illuminating my face in the dimming foyer. Kendrick scoffed loudly, crossing his arms over his chest. He warned me that playing little games on a computer would not save me from a federal subpoena. I completely ignored his taunt. My fingers flew across the keyboard rapidly, typing in a complex series of passwords to bypass my encrypted firewall. I opened the official county property tax database and placed it right next to a highly classified corporate registry file from the state of Delaware. I calmly explained to him that Derek had insisted on a draconian prenuptial agreement to protect his precious startup from me. The contract explicitly stated that any assets acquired through separate private business entities remained completely untouchable in the event of a divorce. Derek thought he was building an ironclad fortress around his money to keep his peasant wife out. He never bothered to realize that the exact same clause offered me the exact same protection. I grasped the edges of my laptop and slowly rotated it 180 degrees, pushing it across the smooth marble counter until it stopped directly in front of Kendrick. I told him in a flat, unwavering voice that I could not sign a quitclaim deed transferring the house back to Derek, even if I wanted to. I pointed directly at the highlighted text on the screen. I explained that Nora, the individual person standing in front of him, did not actually own the property. The house was purchased in full in cash by an irrevocable trust. That trust was managed and completely shielded by an anonymous corporate holding company. And as the sole legally designated beneficiary of that holding company, I possess the absolute undeniable right to evict any non-owner from the premises without a single day of notice. Kendrick leaned forward, a confident smirk still resting on his lips. He was a top-tier corporate lawyer. He dealt with shell companies and trusts every single day of his career. He clearly thought he could easily spot a fatal flaw in my paperwork or find a sloppy loophole to exploit. He adjusted his stance, narrowing his dark eyes as he read the intricate legal jargon glowing on the bright screen. I watched his face closely. I watched the exact second his eyes scanned past the basic property details and landed on the official registered name of the holding company. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The smug, untouchable arrogance completely vanished from his features, wiped away as if it had never existed. The natural warmth drained rapidly from his face. His jaw went slack, and his breath hitched sharply in his throat. He stopped leaning on the counter and took a sudden, unsteady step backward, almost knocking into Beatrice. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes wide and trembling, completely paralyzed by pure, unadulterated terror. Kendrick stood absolutely frozen, his dark eyes darting back and forth across the glowing screen, as if trying to force the letters to rearrange themselves into a different, less terrifying combination. His breath hitched again, shallow and uneven. As a top-tier corporate lawyer, his entire career was built on pattern recognition memory and connecting invisible financial dots. He recognized the registered name of the holding company instantly. He had personally reviewed the heavily redacted term sheets for Derek's startup just 3 weeks ago, when they were celebrating their massive cash influx. The anonymous shell company that held the legal deed to my house was the exact same venture capital entity that had just injected $5 million into Derek's business. The mathematical reality of the situation crashed down on Kendrick like a physical weight. Nora was not a broke, helpless housewife playing a cute little prank with a laptop. She was the primary investor. She was the silent, untouchable puppet master who completely owned the majority stake in his brother-in-law's highly leveraged tech startup. Kendrick instantly realized that if they pushed me into a legal corner, I did not just have the power to keep the house. I had the power to recall the venture capital funding trigger a hostile takeover and completely annihilate Derek's entire financial existence by tomorrow morning. Furthermore, if Kendrick officially represented Derek in a lawsuit against the very entity funding the company, it would create a catastrophic conflict of interest that could get Kendrick disbarred. Kendrick snapped out of his paralyzed state. Survival instinct took over. He did not say a single word to me. He did not ask for clarification or try to negotiate. He simply reached out with shaking hands, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and violently snapped the brass latches shut. He spun around, grabbing his wife Claire by the elbow with a grip so tight she let out a sharp gasp. He roughly pulled her away from my antique side table. He commanded her in a low, dangerous growl to put the Italian ceramic vase down right this second and step away from my property. Claire looked at him as if he had lost his mind. She whined, complaining that he was hurting her arm and demanding to know why he was suddenly backing down from a woman they were supposed to be throwing onto the street. Kendrick completely ignored her complaints. He dragged her toward the heavy oak front door, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate energy. He turned his attention to Beatrice, who was still standing in the middle of my foyer looking utterly confused and deeply offended by her son-in-law's sudden retreat. Kendrick pointed a rigid finger at the door and barked at Beatrice to shut her mouth. Turn around and walk out of the house immediately. He told her they were leaving right now and that she was not to speak another single word to me under any circumstances. Beatrice's confusion instantly morphed into explosive, arrogant anger. She was a woman who was used to giving orders, not receiving them. She planted her designer shoes firmly on my hardwood floor, crossing her arms stubbornly. She demanded to know what was wrong with him. She screamed that he was acting like a coward, insisting that whatever fake document I had typed up on my little computer was just a cheap parlor trick meant to scare them. She ordered Kendrick to open his briefcase back up and do the job they had brought him here to do. Kendrick let go of Claire's arm and took 2 steps toward Beatrice. His face twisted in pure frustration. He lowered his voice, trying to convey the immense gravity of the situation, without revealing the highly confidential financial secret to his loudmouth mother-in-law. He warned Beatrice through clenched teeth that she was completely out of her depth. He told her that if she stayed in this house for 1 more minute, she would ruin her son's life forever. He pleaded with her to just walk out the door and let him handle the damage control from his office. But Beatrice was far too arrogant to listen to reason. She truly believed she was the absolute authority figure in the room. She scoffed loudly, waving Kendrick off with a dismissive flick of her wrist. She declared that if the high-paid lawyer was too terrified to put a pathetic little bookkeeper in her place, she would gladly do it herself. Before Kendrick could physically step in to stop her, Beatrice marched directly up to where I was leaning against the kitchen island. Her face was flushed with venomous rage. She raised her hand high in the air and swung it down with all her might. The sharp, stinging crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed loudly through the entire house. My head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. Claire gasped by the front door. Kendrick groaned, dropping his head into his hands, knowing she had just sealed their fate. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly turned my head back to face her, a cold, calculated smile spreading across my lips. I lifted my left wrist, tapped the brightly illuminated screen of my smartwatch, and spoke in a perfectly clear, steady voice. Assault recorded. Uploading to cloud. Kendrick did not wait for Beatrice to argue. The moment I announced the smartwatch recording, the blood drained entirely from his face. He practically shoved both his wife and his mother-in-law toward the heavy front door. He knew a documented assault charge combined with his aggressive legal threats could severely complicate his own standing with the State Bar Association. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving my home in perfect, peaceful silence once again. I applied a cold compress to my stinging cheek, completely unbothered by the physical altercation. Let them panic. The real trap had not even been sprung yet. The very next day, I decided to take my work out of the house. I drove to a high-end bistro downtown, a quiet and highly exclusive place known for excellent espresso and discreet business patrons. I was sitting in a corner booth reviewing the final pieces of forensic financial evidence on my laptop when a shadow fell over my table. I looked up to see Sienna standing there completely uninvited and radiating toxic confidence. She was dressed in a sharp designer suit that cost more than most people made in a solid month of hard work. She was carrying a rare leather handbag that I knew for an absolute fact was purchased using embezzled company funds. She did not ask if she could join me. She simply slid into the plush leather booth opposite mine, crossing her legs and resting her arms on the polished wood table. As she moved, a heavy diamond tennis bracelet wrapped around her wrist caught the ambient light sparkling aggressively. It was another lavish purchase Derek had made, using money he stole from his investors, desperately trying to buy the loyalty of his ambitious mistress. Sienna leaned forward, a condescending smile playing on her lips. She looked at my simple silk blouse and my laptop, clearly mistaking my professional attire for the sad, outdated wardrobe of a discarded housewife. She spoke in a sickly, sweet, patronizing tone, telling me that she actually felt sorry for me. She said it must be incredibly difficult to accept when a highly successful man simply outgrows you. She proudly declared herself a modern, high-value woman, someone who could match Derek's intense drive and elevate his massive tech empire to the next level. She told me I should be extremely proud I got to ride his coattails for a few years, but now it was time for me to step aside gracefully and let the real adults handle the big business. I calmly closed my laptop, giving her my full, undivided attention. I did not raise my voice or take her obvious bait. Her sheer arrogance was truly blinding. She genuinely believed she was the apex predator in the room, completely unaware that she was swimming straight into a carefully constructed federal net. Sienna continued her monologue, casually tracing the rim of the water glass the waiter had just placed on the table. She said Derek was too emotional and foolish for fighting over a suburban house, but she was a highly practical businesswoman. She claimed she did not care about my little real estate tricks because her eyes were focused on the upcoming initial public offering. She told me the startup was about to be valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, and a messy public divorce scandal would definitely scare off their conservative venture capital investors. She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a crisp, professionally bound legal document. She smoothed it out on the table between us. Her voice dropped to a low, threatening register, dropping the fake sweet act entirely. She told me she knew all about the 15% equity stake Derek had foolishly given me years ago when the company was just starting out. She claimed my continued presence on the capitalization table was a massive liability for the company's elite corporate image. She threatened to drag my name through the mud if I did not cooperate. She promised to use Derek's high-powered public relations team to paint me in the media as an unstable, greedy ex-wife, which she assured me would completely destroy my pathetic little freelance bookkeeping business. She said she could easily make my life a living nightmare, dragging me through years of expensive litigation until I was bankrupt, or I could simply take the easy way out today. Sienna slid the thick legal document slowly across the polished wood, stopping it right next to my coffee cup. She produced a heavy silver pen and placed it deliberately on top of the crisp white pages. She looked me dead in the eye, her smug expression solidifying into a hard, ruthless glare. She demanded I sign the paper right now. It was a complete, irrevocable transfer of my entire 15% equity stake directly into her name. She told me to sign it, walk away with my quiet little suburban life, and avoid a massive public scandal that a weak woman like me could never possibly survive. I looked at the heavy silver pen resting on top of the legal document. I looked up at Sienna, whose eyes were practically glowing with predatory excitement. It was time to give her exactly what she wanted. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, shedding the calm, untouchable posture I had maintained since the night Derek walked out. I widened my eyes, forcing a look of absolute cornered panic to spread across my face. I brought my hands up, letting my fingers tremble just enough to be noticeable. I leaned closer to the table, my voice dropping to a desperate, shaky whisper. I begged her not to do this. I told her that my quiet little accounting business was all I had left in the world. I pleaded with her, saying that if she and Derek dragged my name through a massive public scandal, I would lose all my small business clients and end up completely destitute. I told her that I could not afford high-powered lawyers to fight them, and I just wanted to be left alone in peace. Sienna drank in every single word of my performance. Her smug smile stretched into a full, triumphant grin. She leaned back against the plush leather booth, crossing her arms like a victorious general observing a defeated enemy. She let out a short, mocking laugh, thoroughly enjoying the sight of the proud wife finally breaking under her pressure. She told me it was a smart decision to finally accept reality. She assured me that as long as I signed the paper quickly and quietly, she would make sure Derek's public relations team kept my name out of the press. I picked up the silver pen. My hand was shaking so convincingly that I almost impressed myself. I looked down at the signature line hovering the pen over the crisp white paper. The document was a standard corporate transfer agreement. For the symbolic sum of $1, I was fully and irrevocably surrendering my entire 15% equity stake in Derek's tech startup directly into Sienna's personal name. By signing this, she would legally become a major shareholder and a high-ranking corporate officer on paper. I pressed the pen to the paper and quickly scribbled my signature on the bottom line. Sienna practically snatched the document away the second the ink dried. She quickly flipped through the pages, verifying my signature with greedy eyes. Satisfied, she carefully folded the document and tucked it safely back into her expensive designer handbag. She did not even bother to hand me the symbolic $1 bill. She pulled out her sleek smartphone and immediately dialed Derek's number, putting it on speakerphone right there in the middle of the quiet bistro. Derek answered on the first ring, his voice tense and anxious. Sienna did not even say hello. She loudly and proudly announced that the mission was accomplished. She bragged that she had just completely broken the pathetic ex-wife. She told him I had cried, begged for mercy, and signed away the entire 15% equity stake without a single fight. I could hear Derek let out a massive sigh of relief through the speaker. He laughed, a cruel, arrogant sound that echoed from the phone. He told Sienna she was a genius and promised to take her out to the most expensive restaurant in the city to celebrate their massive victory over the woman who tried to steal their future. Sienna blew a kiss into the phone, her eyes locked mockingly on me, and ended the call. She stood up from the booth, smoothing down her designer skirt. She looked down at me one last time, her expression filled with absolute contempt. She told me to enjoy my sad little suburban life, advising me to stay out of the way of real business professionals from now on. Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heels and strutted confidently out of the bistro, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind her. I sat alone in the booth for exactly 10 seconds. I waited until I saw her climb into the back of a luxury town car through the large front window. The moment the car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into city traffic, my entire demeanor instantly shifted. The fake tears vanished completely. The trembling in my hands stopped dead. My posture straightened, cold and completely professional. I reached into the hidden inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a small encrypted burner phone. I did not call a friend or a family member to complain. I quickly dialed a heavily secured direct federal number that very few people in the country possessed. The line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered on the other end. I spoke in a crisp, unwavering tone. I identified myself using my official federal contractor ID number. I informed the agent on the line that the target had just aggressively taken the bait. I confirmed that Sienna had legally assumed ownership of the 15% corporate shares. The voice on the other end of the secure line belonged to Special Agent Miller from the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. He asked for confirmation of the asset transfer. I took a slow, calming breath, watching the city traffic rush by the bistro window, and delivered the final nail in her coffin. I told him that the target had aggressively demanded the shares, completely bypassing any standard corporate due diligence. I confirmed that Sienna had proudly put her signature on the dotted line, totally unaware of the massive financial crater she had just stepped into. I calmly explained the exact mechanics of the trap I had spent the last 12 months building. Derek thought he was an untouchable genius. For years, he had been systematically embezzling company funds, cooking the books, and hiding massive amounts of phantom revenue to artificially inflate his startup valuation for the venture capital investors. To keep his own name clean, he had deliberately buried $12 million in fraudulent tax debt and illegal offshore money laundering under that specific 15% equity block. He assumed that because the shares were technically in my name, I would be the ultimate fall guy if the federal government ever came knocking. But as an elite forensic accountant, I had seen his amateur financial crimes from a mile away. I had secretly and meticulously restructured the internal corporate ledger from my home office. I legally tethered every single ounce of that criminal financial liability directly to the shares themselves. By arrogant demanding that equity to secure her position as a high-value modern woman, Sienna did not just steal a piece of a billion-dollar tech company. She legally volunteered to take full responsibility for $12 million of federal tax fraud. Special Agent Miller let out a low, gravelly chuckle over the encrypted connection. He confirmed that the moment Sienna filed that transfer document with the state corporate registry, which she was undoubtedly rushing to do, right now the trap would snap completely shut. The law would view her as the primary liable officer. The Internal Revenue Service and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network would immediately begin the process of freezing her personal assets, seizing her bank accounts, and preparing the federal indictments. I thanked Special Agent Miller for his time, ended the call, and finished the last sip of my espresso. The coffee tasted exceptionally sweet. Across town in the penthouse suite of his sleek downtown office building, Derek was practically floating on air. He had no idea a federal net was rapidly closing around his empire. He had just ended the triumphant phone call with Sienna and genuinely believed he had won the war. He was absolutely convinced he had completely outsmarted his boring suburban wife, secured his massive fortune, and paved the way for his company to go public. To celebrate his perceived victory, and to dazzle his incoming venture capital investors, he was busy finalizing the details for an incredibly lavish corporate gala scheduled for that coming weekend. He was sitting at his massive glass desk surrounded by high-end event planners and catering managers. He was in his element, barking arrogant orders and demanding only the most expensive luxuries. He insisted on imported beluga caviar towering crystal champagne pyramids and a live string quartet flown in specifically for the night. He wanted the event to be a shining monument to his massive ego and financial brilliance. The lead event planner, a nervous woman clutching a sleek silver tablet, politely interrupted his rant to request the final payment for the venue and the luxury catering services. She needed a wire transfer of $200,000 to secure the reservations by the end of the business day. Derek scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively, as if $200,000 was nothing but spare change. He loudly bragged to the room about the massive influx of venture capital cash they were managing, and how money was no object for a company of his caliber. He confidently opened his heavy platinum laptop, logged into his primary corporate banking portal, and initiated the wire transfer. He typed in the massive sum, hit submit with a forceful tap of his finger, and leaned back in his ergonomic leather chair with a smug, self-satisfied smile, waiting for the green confirmation screen to pop up. But the green checkmark never appeared. Instead, the screen froze for an agonizing 10 seconds. The loading icon spun uselessly. Derek frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. He aggressively clicked the refresh button, assuming it was a simple glitch in the bank's software. He tried to process the transaction a second time, typing the numbers faster and hitting enter with annoyance. The screen blinked. A harsh, bright red banner suddenly flashed across the top of his display. It did not say insufficient funds. It did not say network timeout. It displayed two stark, terrifying words that struck absolute terror into the heart of any corporate executive. Federal hold. Derek stared at the bright red banner on his monitor, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. The words federal hold glared back at him, mocking his entire existence. He frantically grabbed his mouse, clicking out of the window and opening his secondary corporate accounts. He typed in his credentials with shaking fingers. Every single screen loaded with the exact same terrifying red banner. His entire financial network, millions of dollars in operating capital, was completely frozen. The nervous event planner cleared her throat, shifting her weight from foot to foot. She politely asked if there was an issue with the bank and if they needed to postpone the catering deposit. Derek snapped. He slammed his fists down on the glass desk, screaming at her to get out of his office immediately. The woman jumped, clutching her tablet to her chest, and practically sprinted out the heavy glass door. Derek was left alone in the dead silence of his penthouse suite. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He grabbed his smartphone, his hands trembling violently, and dialed Kendrick. He paced behind his desk, waiting for his brother-in-law to answer. The second the line connected, Derek began shouting orders. He demanded Kendrick drop whatever he was doing and march down to a federal courthouse. He ordered him to file an emergency injunction against the bank, claiming I had somehow hacked his accounts and was trying to sabotage his business right before the venture capital funding round. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. When Kendrick finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant edge. It was cold, detached, and dripping with absolute dread. Kendrick did not acknowledge the demands for an injunction. Instead, he asked Derek if he had any idea who he had been sleeping next to for the last 5 years. Derek stopped pacing, confusion piercing through his panic. He yelled that he did not have time for riddles and demanded legal action. Kendrick let out a hollow, humorless laugh. He explained that after the humiliating encounter at my house the day before, he had refused to let things go. He had called in several massive favors from his high-level contacts within the state and federal registry. He had spent the entire night digging into my background, bypassing the basic tax returns Derek usually handled. Kendrick delivered the crushing blow. He told Derek that I was not a freelance bookkeeper doing math for local bakeries. He revealed that I was an elite forensic accountant holding top-tier security clearance contracted directly by the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice to dismantle complex corporate fraud rings. Kendrick practically shouted through the phone, telling Derek that I had been building a federal case against his startup from our own guest bedroom for an entire year. Derek felt the blood completely drain from his face. His knees went weak, forcing him to collapse heavily into his ergonomic leather chair. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a lie about his clean books, but Kendrick cut him off. Kendrick informed him that the moment Sienna filed the paperwork to take my 15% equity stake, she triggered a massive federal tripwire. Kendrick, as a brilliant corporate lawyer, had already reviewed the company ledgers. He knew exactly where the $12 million of offshore money laundering was buried. He told Derek that the federal hold was not a mistake. It was the first step of a massive asset seizure. Before Derek could even process the reality of a federal indictment, Kendrick delivered his final strike. He stated in a completely formal and legally binding tone that he was officially resigning as the corporate counsel for Derek's startup effective immediately. He said he was severing all professional ties to protect his own law firm and his own legal license from being dragged into a federal racketeering charge. Kendrick hung up the phone, leaving Derek listening to the dead, empty dial tone. Across town, inside Kendrick and Claire's sprawling suburban home, the atmosphere was equally explosive. Kendrick was frantically throwing expensive suits and essential documents into a heavy leather travel bag. He was shredding files in his home office, preparing to completely distance himself from his wife's toxic family. The door to the office flew open, slamming hard against the wall. Claire stood in the doorway, her face twisted in a mask of pure, entitled rage. She gripped her phone in her hand, having just received a hysterical, hyperventilating call from Derek. She marched into the room, kicking a pile of shredded paper out of her way. She screamed at her husband, demanding to know why he was abandoning her brother in his darkest hour. She accused Kendrick of being a coward, insisting that family always came first and that he was obligated to use his legal expertise to save Derek from my supposed revenge plot. Kendrick zipped his travel bag shut with a sharp, violent tug. He turned to face his wife, his eyes completely devoid of warmth. He told Claire she was just as delusional as her mother and her brother. The massive fight erupted, shattering the fragile walls of their marriage. Claire stood blocking the doorway of their home office, her face red with indignation. She pointed a trembling finger at the travel bag Kendrick had just zipped shut. She demanded to know where he thought he was going, while her brother was facing a catastrophic banking error. Kendrick let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. He told her she was completely oblivious to the hurricane about to tear their lives apart. He explained, speaking slowly, as if addressing a stubborn child, that the federal government does not make banking errors. He told her Derek was not the victim of a glitch, but the target of a massive federal racketeering and tax evasion probe. Just as Claire opened her mouth to argue, the heavy front door of their house swung open. Beatrice marched down the hallway, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. She had rushed over the second Derek called her in a panic. Beatrice stormed into the office, her eyes locking onto Kendrick. She did not ask what was happening. She issued a command. She told Kendrick to stop throwing a tantrum, get his checkbook, and wire $200,000 of his own money to Derek's corporate account to cover the gala and the incoming legal fees. She said it was the least he could do for the family that had graciously welcomed him into their elite circle. That single comment was the spark that ignited years of repressed resentment. Kendrick slowly lowered his travel bag to the floor. He looked at Beatrice and then at his wife. His dark eyes were cold and uncompromising. He told Beatrice that her twisted sense of superiority was exactly what had blinded her to the truth. For years, he had endured their passive-aggressive comments, their subtle racial microaggressions at country club dinners, and their overwhelming sense of entitlement. He had played the role of the quiet, useful lawyer because the money was good, but he was absolutely done playing. Kendrick took a step toward Beatrice, his towering presence forcing her to take a nervous step back. He told them they were all blind fools who had messed with the wrong woman. He explained that Nora was not some helpless housewife they could bully into submission. She was an elite federal investigator who had methodically built an ironclad case against Derek right under their arrogant noses. He stated that Derek was going to lose the company, his freedom, and every single penny he had ever stolen. Claire burst into tears, begging Kendrick to use his brilliant legal mind to find a loophole. She grabbed his arm, but he firmly detached her hand. He picked up his heavy leather travel bag and slung it over his shoulder. He looked at the two women with absolute disgust. He stated clearly that he had spent his entire life working to build a pristine legal career, and he would absolutely not go to federal prison for a racist, entitled family that never truly respected him. Without another word, he walked past them down the hallway and out the front door, leaving Claire sobbing on the floor and Beatrice standing in stunned, humiliated silence. While his family was shattering into pieces in the suburbs, Derek was experiencing a complete psychological collapse inside his downtown penthouse office. The harsh red banner declaring a federal hold remained burned onto his computer monitors. He was completely locked out of the traditional banking system. Kendrick had abandoned him. Sienna was out filing the paperwork that would ironically seal her own doom. Derek was completely isolated, and the reality of an impending criminal raid was finally sinking in. He needed liquid cash immediately. He needed enough untraceable money to hire a team of elite criminal defense attorneys, or perhaps enough to charter a private flight out of the country before his passport was flagged. He rushed over to the heavy modern artwork hanging on his office wall and swung it open to reveal a hidden wall safe. His hands were shaking so violently, he entered the combination wrong twice before finally hearing the heavy steel bolts click open. He reached inside and pulled out a small, heavily encrypted flash drive. It was his absolute safety net. Over the last 3 years, he had skimmed a massive fortune from his venture capital investors and funneled it through international tumblers into anonymous offshore cryptocurrency accounts. He rushed back to his desk, plugged the drive into his laptop, and booted up the Shadow Exchange portal. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he carefully typed in his 24-word recovery phrase. This was his hidden empire, his untouchable millions that Nora could never possibly find. He hit enter and held his breath, waiting for the dashboard to load. The screen refreshed, displaying his secure digital wallet. Derek stared at the monitor, his blood running completely cold. The total balance of his secret, untouchable offshore fortune was exactly $0.00. Derek stared at the glaring zero on the screen. His mind completely rejected the image. He frantically clicked the refresh button, pounding his finger against the mouse, desperate for the Shadow Exchange to load a different number. He convinced himself it was a server lag, a temporary glitch in the blockchain network. But the screen refreshed, and the balance remained a stark, mocking zero. The millions of dollars he had painstakingly stolen and hidden away were gone. His panic morphed into a desperate sweating investigation. He opened the security settings of his digital wallet and pulled up the access logs, expecting to see an anonymous federal agency or a foreign hacker syndicate. Instead, his eyes scanned a long list of encrypted logins dating back over 12 months. With trembling hands, he ran a trace on the most frequent origin node. The geolocation coordinates popped up on a digital map. They did not point to a government building in Washington. They pointed directly to his own affluent suburban neighborhood. The IP address matched the router sitting on a shelf in his very own living room. Derek collapsed back into his chair, his mind racing as he connected the impossible dots. He pulled up his company's master server architecture, a domain he rarely checked because he arrogantly assumed his tech team had everything secured. He bypassed the standard firewalls and dug deep into the administrative audit logs. He found a ghost user account that had been granted the highest level of system clearance. The account had been running highly complex data, scraping algorithms, quietly siphoning internal financial records, vendor invoices, and wire transfer receipts for an entire year. He looked at the timestamps on the ghost account. They matched perfectly with his own memories. The system was extracting massive amounts of data during the exact hours he would come home late and find me sitting at the kitchen island, quietly tapping away on my laptop. Every single time he walked past me, smugly asked how my little freelance bookkeeping business was doing, and went upstairs to call his mistress. I was actually deep inside his corporate mainframe. The sheer scale of his own arrogance hit him like a freight train. He suddenly remembered all the nights he carelessly left his heavy platinum laptop open on the coffee table while he took a shower. He remembered pacing the living room, bragging loudly on the phone to his sketchy offshore contacts, casually dropping hints about Tumblr accounts and shell company names. He had treated me like a decorative piece of furniture, a woman far too simple-minded to understand his complex world of high finance. But the audit logs painted a terrifyingly different picture. While he was playing the role of a brilliant startup founder, I was systematically mapping his entire criminal enterprise. I had traced every single fake invoice, unraveled every complicated layer of his money laundering scheme, and perfectly timed the total liquidation of his offshore crypto wallet to coincide with the exact moment the federal government locked his traditional bank accounts. I had not just taken his money, I had surgically dismantled his entire life from the comfort of our own home. The weight of his profound stupidity finally crushed him. His breathing became ragged and shallow, sounding like a wounded animal trapped in a cage. He did not feel an ounce of remorse for his massive financial crimes. He did not feel regret for the cruel way he had treated me. He only felt a blinding, toxic rage toward the woman who had dared to outsmart him. He let out a guttural scream and swept his arm violently across his sleek glass desk. His expensive monitors, a crystal whiskey decanter, and framed magazine covers crashed to the hardwood floor in a shower of shattered glass and sparking wires. The sophisticated, untouchable executive persona completely shattered with them. He stalked over to the far corner of his penthouse office. Resting against the wall was a heavy, solid ashwood baseball bat, a custom-engraved gift he had received from an early investor to celebrate a successful business pitch. He wrapped his hand around the leather grip, his knuckles turning stark white from the pressure. He no longer cared about the federal hold. He no longer cared about the venture capital funding or Sienna's impending arrest. All logic, reason, and self-preservation had completely evaporated from his mind, replaced by a dark, violent obsession to regain dominance. He stormed out of the ruined office, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He stepped out into the cold, empty downtown street and aggressively hailed a passing city taxi. He threw open the door, slid into the back seat, and barked out the address to the suburban house he no longer legally owned. He sat in the darkness of the cab, gripping the heavy wooden bat tight against his chest, speeding through the middle of the night with only one terrifying goal. He was going to break down my door and force me to reverse the transfers, no matter how much violence it took. The yellow city taxi jerked to a halt at the edge of the driveway. Derek threw a crumpled $50 bill at the driver and kicked the door open before the car even fully stopped. The cool suburban night air did nothing to calm the blistering rage burning in his chest. He marched up the concrete driveway, his expensive leather shoes stomping heavily against the pavement. In his right hand, he gripped the custom ashwood baseball bat so tightly his knuckles ached. He reached the front porch and did not hesitate for a single second. He raised the heavy wooden bat and swung it in a vicious upward arc directly into the expensive glass fixture of the left porch light. The bulb exploded with a sharp, violent crack. A rain of shattered glass and twisted metal rained down onto the welcome mat. He immediately turned and smashed the right porch light, plunging the entire entryway into deep, ominous shadows. Standing in the darkness, Derek planted his feet wide and began to scream at the top of his lungs. He did not care that the neighbors were undoubtedly waking up or that bedroom lights were flicking on down the street. He roared my name, demanding that I undo the blockchain transfers immediately. He shouted that my little federal investigator act meant absolutely nothing to him and that he would burn the house to the ground if I did not give back his money. When his initial screams were met with absolute silence from inside the house, Derek resorted to the ultimate form of extortion. He pointed the bat at the front door and yelled a desperate, disgusting lie. He claimed he had secretly installed hidden cameras in our master bedroom during our marriage. He screamed that he possessed hours of explicit, highly compromising footage of me. His voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood as he threatened to release every single video to the press. He swore he would leak the fake sex tape to local news outlets, internet blogs, and forward it directly to my supervisors at the Department of Justice. He promised to completely obliterate my pristine professional reputation and ensure I never worked in the federal government again unless his offshore accounts were fully restored by sunrise. He waited for a reaction, panting heavily in the dark. He expected the door to fly open. He expected me to run out in tears, completely broken by the threat of public humiliation, ready to hand over the encryption keys to save my career. But the house remained completely silent and still. That total lack of fear pushed Derek completely over the edge of sanity. He let out a guttural roar, pulled the baseball bat back over his shoulder, and swung it forward with every ounce of physical strength he possessed. The solid ash wood slammed into the heavy oak front door with a deafening thud. Wood splintered. The impact sent a painful shockwave all the way up his arms, but he ignored it. He stepped back, adjusted his grip, and wound up for a second even more violent swing, fully intending to bash his way into the foyer. Just as the bat reached the highest point of his backswing, the heavy brass deadbolt clicked loudly. The door swung open in a smooth, rapid motion, flooding the dark porch with warm yellow light from the hallway. Derek froze instantly. His arms remained suspended awkwardly in the air. A twisted smile began to form on his lips, fully expecting to see me cowering on the other side of the threshold. But the person standing in the doorway was not a terrified housewife. It was a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing the crisp, dark navy blue uniform of the local police department. A heavy utility belt hung around his waist, and a gleaming gold badge was pinned over his heart, clearly identifying him as the chief of police. The chief was not drawing his weapon or shouting commands. He was simply standing there completely relaxed, holding one of my favorite ceramic coffee mugs in his right hand. The chief took a slow, deliberate sip of the steaming, dark roast coffee. He lowered the mug, his eyes locking onto Derek and the baseball bat suspended in the air. He looked at the shattered glass covering the porch and the deep dent in the oak door. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed. Derek slowly lowered the bat, the blood draining entirely from his face. His mind scrambled to invent an excuse to claim it was a domestic misunderstanding, but his voice completely failed him. The chief simply raised an eyebrow, took another sip of coffee, and asked Derek if he usually conducted his financial negotiations by destroying private property in the middle of the night. The heavy ashwood bat slipped from Derek's fingers, clattering loudly against the wooden deck. He stood frozen in the shadows of the porch, staring at the chief of police. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but not a single sound managed to escape his throat. I stepped out from the brightly lit hallway, moving to stand safely behind the chief's broad shoulder. I was holding my own cup of herbal tea, perfectly calm, wearing a comfortable cashmere sweater. I looked at the shattered glass covering my welcome mat and the deep splintered dent in my heavy oak door. I shook my head slightly, looking up at the chief, and noted that it certainly looked like the intentional destruction of private property. The chief nodded in agreement. He handed his coffee mug back to me with a polite word of thanks. He stepped over the threshold, his posture instantly shifting from relaxed neighbor to highly authoritative law enforcement officer. He reached behind his back, unclipped the heavy metal handcuffs from his utility belt, and instructed Derek to turn around and place his hands behind his back. Derek finally found his voice. Panic laced every word as he started stammering, desperately trying to deploy his usual corporate charm. He held his hands up defensively, claiming it was just a passionate marital dispute, and that he legally owned the house anyway. He told the chief there was absolutely no need for handcuffs and suggested they could just talk it out like reasonable gentlemen. The chief was entirely unimpressed by the frantic display. He lunged forward, grabbing Derek by the shoulder and spinning him around forcefully. He informed Derek that he was currently trespassing on a property owned by an independent legal trust. The chief listed off the charges in a flat, clinical tone as he pinned Derek's arms: vandalism, attempted breaking and entering, and most importantly, a direct documented violation of an emergency restraining order. Derek gasped, his cheek pressed hard against the exterior siding of my house as the cold steel cuffs snapped tightly around his wrists. He yelled out, demanding to know what restraining order the chief was talking about. I took a slow sip of my tea. I told him I had filed the paperwork quietly at the county courthouse 3 days ago. As a federal investigator dealing exclusively with high-level financial criminals, I knew exactly how volatile a narcissist became the second their access to money was cut off. I knew he would eventually show up at my door in the middle of the night, demanding the return of his stolen millions. The judge had reviewed my federal credentials and signed the emergency order without a moment of hesitation. By simply stepping onto my driveway, Derek had committed an instant jailable offense. A black and white patrol cruiser pulled up to the curb, its red and blue emergency lights flashing silently in the dark to avoid waking the entire street. 2 younger officers stepped out, jogging quickly up the driveway to assist the chief. They took firm hold of Derek's arms, dragging him aggressively down the porch steps. The absolute humiliation finally broke whatever remained of his sanity. As the officers marched him toward the street, Derek began to thrash and scream. He kicked his expensive Italian leather shoes against the pavement, shouting my name, cursing me, and swearing he would ruin my life. He looked completely unhinged, a raving lunatic, throwing a violent physical tantrum in a pristine suburban neighborhood. The officers shoved him forcefully into the cramped plastic back seat of the squad car, slamming the heavy door shut and instantly cutting off his frantic screaming. I thanked the chief for his quick response. He tipped his hat, promising me the station would process the charges to the fullest extent of the law. I watched the cruiser drive away, its taillights fading into the night, before I calmly went back inside, locked the door, and went to sleep. Derek spent the rest of the night shivering on a steel bench inside a cold, concrete holding cell at the county jail. The harsh reality of his situation crashed down on him. His tailored suit was ruined. He had zero access to his frozen bank accounts, and his offshore crypto wallets were empty. When the guard finally offered him his one allowed phone call the next morning, he did not call a defense attorney. He desperately dialed Sienna. He stood at the greasy wall phone listening to the line ring. Sienna picked up, but her voice was sharp and frantic. Derek begged her to come down to the station and post his bail, using her personal credit cards, promising to pay her back the second the federal hold was lifted. Sienna let out a bitter, mocking laugh. She told him he was completely delusional. She screamed into the phone that her own accounts had just been frozen by the Internal Revenue Service, and that federal agents were currently tossing her luxury apartment. She called him a pathetic loser, blamed him entirely for destroying her career, and explicitly told him she would rather rot than spend a single penny to bail him out. The line went dead. Completely out of options, Derek was forced to call his mother. Beatrice arrived at the bail bondsman office 2 hours later, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. Because Kendrick had completely cut them off and the bail was set incredibly high due to Derek's violent outburst and flight risk, Beatrice had no other choice. She sat across from a sleazy bail agent, her hands shaking violently as she signed a thick stack of legally binding documents. To secure her golden boy's temporary freedom, Beatrice was forced to entirely liquidate her hard-earned retirement pension, accepting a massive early withdrawal penalty and signing away her entire financial future. Beatrice left the grim fluorescent-lit office of the bail bondsman with her financial future entirely decimated. She had signed away the massive retirement pension she had spent decades accumulating just to purchase her son a temporary release from a county jail cell. Derek was free, but he was completely broken, panicked, and utterly useless. Instead of holding her arrogant son accountable for the absolute disaster he had created, Beatrice did what she had always done. She found a scapegoat. She directed every single ounce of her boiling toxic rage directly at me. Later that afternoon, I was enjoying a rare moment of peace at the Oakwood Country Club. It was a highly exclusive establishment, a place where the local elite gathered to network and gossip over expensive champagne. Beatrice prided herself on being a legacy member here. She viewed the club as her personal kingdom. I was seated at a prime table near the center of the main dining room, enjoying a light and beautifully plated salad, while reviewing some final federal audit reports on my encrypted tablet. The atmosphere was tranquil, filled with the soft clinking of crystal glasses and the low, polite hum of wealthy patrons discussing their weekend plans. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany double doors of the dining room burst open with a violent crash. The soft piano music playing in the corner abruptly stopped. I looked up from my tablet to see Beatrice marching through the entryway, completely ignoring the frantic protests of the maitre d'. She had entirely lost her polished high society veneer. Her expensive designer coat was unbuttoned and hanging off one shoulder. Her hair was completely disheveled, and her face was flushed a dark, furious shade of crimson. She stomped aggressively across the patterned carpet, her heels digging into the floor, heading straight for my table. The polite hum of conversation in the room vanished instantly, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. Every single head in the dining room turned to watch the spectacle. Beatrice reached my table and slammed both of her hands down hard onto the crisp white tablecloth. The impact rattled my silverware and caused my water glass to spill over, soaking the linen. She did not care. She opened her mouth and began to scream at the absolute top of her lungs, ensuring that every single wealthy patron in the room heard every word. She announced to her peers that I was a deceitful, manipulative gold digger who had just falsely imprisoned her brilliant and innocent son. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her voice echoing harshly off the high vaulted ceilings. She accused me of orchestrating a massive, illegal financial conspiracy to steal Derek's booming tech company. She yelled that I was a worthless parasite who had leeched off her family for 5 long years and was now throwing a violent tantrum because Derek had finally realized my true nature and filed for divorce. I sat perfectly still, letting her scream. I did not shrink back in my chair, and I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I looked around the silent dining room. These were Beatrice's closest friends, her fellow board members, and the people whose opinions she valued more than oxygen. They were staring at her with wide, horrified eyes, completely captivated by the grotesque public meltdown of the usually composed socialite. Beatrice then played her ultimate victim card. She dramatically placed a hand over her chest and shrieked that my malicious lies had forced her to drain her entire life savings. She screamed that I had stolen an old woman's retirement pension, forcing her to liquidate everything she owned just to save her son from my vindictive trap. She demanded that I be arrested, thrown out of the country club, and permanently exiled from their society. She stood there panting heavily, her chest heaving, waiting for me to break down crying in front of the entire town. I casually wiped my mouth with a dry corner of my linen napkin and placed it neatly next to my plate. I looked up at her, my expression completely blank and unbothered. I told her in a calm, clear voice that she was embarrassing herself and that she should sit down before she did irreparable damage to her pristine reputation. That only added explosive fuel to her fire. She shrieked that she had nothing to be embarrassed about and that I was the one whose entire life was going to be exposed and ruined today. I realized then that words would never be enough to penetrate her delusion. She needed to see the cold, undeniable truth, and she needed to see it in front of the exact audience she was trying to weaponize against me. I caught the eye of the head waiter, a discreet man who had been hovering nervously near the service station. I gave him a subtle, prearranged nod. He quickly stepped forward and placed a small black remote control directly into the palm of my hand. The main dining room of the Oakwood Country Club was equipped with a massive high-definition drop-down screen typically used for charity auctions and corporate presentations. I picked up the remote, aimed it toward the ceiling, and pressed the power button. A mechanical hum filled the silent room as the giant white screen began to lower from the ceiling right behind Beatrice. The heavy white canvas unrolled from the ceiling with a quiet mechanical whir. Beatrice paused her screaming, glancing over her shoulder in pure confusion as the bright projector beam illuminated the fabric. I did not say a word as I tapped a few commands onto my encrypted tablet. Within seconds, the screen mirrored my display, projecting a crystal-clear massive image of official banking records for the entire dining room to see. The numbers were large, and the certified financial institution logos at the top of the documents were absolutely undeniable. I stood up from my chair, my voice calm and projecting effortlessly across the dead-silent room. I addressed Beatrice directly, though I made sure every single one of her wealthy friends heard my words clearly. I told her that she was absolutely right about one specific detail. She had indeed liquidated her entire retirement pension this morning. I pointed to the glowing screen, highlighting a massive wire transfer originating from her personal accounts and landing directly into a temporary holding account under Derek's name. Beatrice crossed her arms, her chin jutting out defiantly. She proudly declared to the room that she had done what any loyal mother would do to protect her innocent son from a malicious, vindictive woman. She claimed the money was specifically designated to hire the best criminal defense attorneys in the state. I smiled a cold and completely hollow expression and swiped my finger across my tablet screen. The projected image shifted to the very next page of the bank ledger. I asked Beatrice if she had actually bothered to verify where her life savings went after Derek gained access to the funds. I highlighted a second transaction time-stamped exactly 45 minutes after her massive deposit cleared. I read the financial details aloud. The hundreds of thousands of dollars did not go to a high-powered law firm. The funds were not transferred to a legal retainer, a bail bondsman, or a defense fund. The exact dollar amount was wired directly into the corporate account of a highly exclusive imported luxury car dealership located downtown. And the authorized recipient, listed on the vehicle title transfer, was not Derek. It was Sienna. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the country club dining room. I zoomed in on the electronic receipt, blowing up the text so large that even the patrons seated in the back row could read it perfectly. It was the finalized purchase agreement for a custom-ordered brand-new Porsche. Derek had taken his mother's absolute last dime, the money meant to secure his legal freedom, and used it to buy his demanding mistress a luxury sports car in a desperate attempt to appease her anger and keep her quiet. The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face. Her defiant, arrogant posture collapsed in a single instant. She slowly turned around to face the massive screen, her eyes wide and trembling as she stared at the undeniable mathematical proof of her son's profound betrayal. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. The friends she had spent decades trying to impress, the elite social circle she worshipped more than anything else, were now looking at her with a mixture of deep pity and absolute disgust. She was no longer a respected socialite matriarch. She was the foolish, bankrupted mother of a selfish criminal. Beatrice's legs simply gave out beneath her. She collapsed heavily into one of the velvet dining chairs. Her hands gripping the armrests so tightly, her knuckles turned stark white. She began to hyperventilate, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, as the terrifying reality of her permanent destitution finally set in. I calmly disconnected my tablet, picked up my purse, and walked past her table. I told her to enjoy her lunch, leaving her completely broken and sobbing in the middle of the silent room. Miles away from the pristine country club, Derek was hiding in a cheap, dimly lit motel room on the absolute outskirts of the city. It was the only place he could secure with the meager cash he had managed to scrounge from his jacket pockets. He was pacing furiously back and forth across the stained carpet, his mind racing for a way out of the federal net. He had bought the Porsche to stop Sienna from going to the authorities, genuinely believing he still had a chance to salvage his real estate tech empire if he could just get to the venture capital investors before the federal government locked the corporate doors. Suddenly, his cracked smartphone buzzed violently on the cheap wooden nightstand. It was not a text message or a standard email notification. It was an overriding emergency alert flashing in bright red text across his locked screen. He snatched the phone up, his heart pounding painfully against his ribs. It was an official, legally binding corporate summons sent directly to his executive inbox. A mandatory emergency shareholder meeting had just been called effective at exactly 9 o'clock the very next morning. And the entity demanding his immediate presence was the anonymous majority investor who owned 51% of his entire company. Derek stared at the glaring red emergency summons on his cracked phone screen, the cheap neon sign of the motel buzzing loudly outside his window. The anonymous majority investor was making their final move. He could not hide in the outskirts of the city while his empire was carved up. He grabbed his ruined suit jacket, hailed another cab with his last few crumpled bills, and headed straight back to the downtown corporate headquarters. He bypassed the confused night security guard and took the private executive elevator up to the penthouse floor. He burst through the heavy glass doors of the main boardroom, expecting to find it empty. Instead, he found Sienna. She was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table, and she looked absolutely unhinged. Her pristine high society image was completely shattered. Her designer hair was a tangled mess, her expensive makeup was streaked with dark tears, and she was frantically shoving stacks of confidential corporate documents into an industrial paper shredder. The moment the boardroom doors swung shut, Sienna whipped around. Her eyes were wild, filled with a rabid, desperate panic. She did not run to comfort him or ask about his night in jail. She marched directly toward him and screamed that federal agents had just kicked down the door of her luxury apartment. She shrieked that her personal bank accounts were entirely frozen, her credit cards were completely useless, and the authorities had physically impounded the brand new Porsche he had bought her just hours prior. She stood inches from his face, her chest heaving as she accused him of destroying her life. She yelled that she was now the primary target of a massive federal probe for tax evasion and offshore money laundering. Without a second of hesitation, Sienna raised her hand and slapped Derek across the face with everything she had. The sharp, echoing crack rang out through the massive boardroom. Derek stumbled back, clutching his stinging jaw. The last shred of his affection for his ambitious mistress instantly evaporated, replaced by pure defensive venom. He stepped forward, towering over her, and screamed right back. He told her she was a greedy, arrogant fool who had orchestrated her own downfall. He explained that his financial books were perfectly hidden and completely secure until she decided to play the role of the ruthless corporate conqueror. He shouted that my 15% equity stake was the exact block of shares carrying the $12 million of fraudulent tax debt. By forcing me to sign that transfer document in the middle of a public bistro, she had legally volunteered to take on the entire criminal liability. He blamed her entirely, roaring that if she had just left my shares alone, the federal audit would have never been triggered, and they would still be rich. Sienna gasped, the blood draining from her face as the horrific reality of the share transfer finally clicked in her mind. She realized I had not surrendered in defeat. I had handed her a ticking time bomb, and she had proudly signed her name right on the detonator. She collapsed into one of the plush leather boardroom chairs, burying her face in her hands. She sobbed violently, cursing Derek for using her as a human shield and cursing herself for walking blindly into my trap. Derek ignored her tears. He slammed his cracked smartphone onto the mahogany table, pushing it toward her. He aggressively tapped the screen, displaying the emergency summons from the venture capital firm. He told her to stop crying because the federal government was no longer their most immediate threat. The anonymous majority investor who owned 51% of the company had called a mandatory meeting for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. He explained that the investor was clearly planning to fire them both, seize the company assets, and leave them completely defenseless against the federal indictments. Sienna slowly lifted her head, staring at the glowing screen. Her tears stopped falling. Her ruthless predatory survival instinct began to overpower her panic. She wiped her ruined makeup with the back of her hand and sat up straight. She was a deeply flawed human being, but she knew corporate bylaws better than anyone else in the building. She stared at the summons, her eyes narrowing as a dark, desperate plan began to form. She looked up at Derek, her voice dropping to a cold, calculating whisper. She pointed out a hidden loophole in their original corporate charter. As the acting chief executive officer and the newly registered holder of the 15% equity block, the two of them still retained total executive voting rights until the shareholder meeting officially commenced tomorrow morning. She told Derek that if they convened a sudden executive board vote at 8 in the morning, just 1 hour before the mandatory meeting, they had the legal authority to authorize the immediate issuance of millions of new phantom shares. Derek's eyes widened as he grasped the sheer audacity of her scheme. By flooding the capitalization table with millions of new shares under their own direct control, they would forcefully dilute the venture capital firm's 51% majority stake down to a powerless minority fraction. They decided their only way out was to execute this hostile maneuver, essentially stealing the entire company back from the investors, regaining total control of the corporate treasury, and using the remaining funds to flee the country before the federal indictments came down. The sun rose over the city skyline, casting long, harsh shadows across the sleek corporate headquarters of Derek's real estate technology startup. Inside the massive glass-enclosed boardroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. It was 8:45 in the morning. Derek and Sienna had been awake all night, fueled by pure panic and expensive espresso. At exactly 8 o'clock, they had desperately logged into the company's internal registry, attempting to execute their hostile executive order. They had frantically authorized the creation of 10 million new phantom shares, praying the system would process the dilution before the anonymous venture capital investors arrived. Now the heavy mahogany table was surrounded by the company's minority shareholders, legal advisors, and confused executive board members. They were whispering anxiously among themselves. The news of the federal hold on the corporate bank accounts had inevitably leaked, spreading like wildfire through the company chat channels. Derek stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, tugging nervously at the collar of his tailored suit. His usual arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the twitchy, erratic energy of a cornered animal. Sienna sat rigidly in the chair nearest the exit, her eyes red and swollen, hiding her ruined face behind thick designer sunglasses. The digital clock on the wall flipped to 8:55. Derek knew he had to get ahead of the narrative before the proxy representative for the 51% majority investor walked into the room. He forced a wide, completely unconvincing smile onto his face and walked up to the polished wooden podium at the head of the table. He gripped the edges of the podium so tightly his knuckles turned white, trying to hide the violent tremor in his hands. He cleared his throat, projecting his voice across the tense boardroom. He thanked everyone for attending on such incredibly short notice. He acknowledged the circulating rumors regarding the frozen corporate bank accounts, waving his hand dismissively, as if a massive federal asset seizure was nothing more than a minor administrative clerical error. He assured the board of directors that the company was entirely financially solvent, and that the upcoming initial public offering was still on schedule. Then he launched into his carefully rehearsed sob story. He lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a deeply exhausted, unfairly victimized man. He told the board that the temporary financial freeze had absolutely nothing to do with corporate fraud or mismanagement. He claimed it was the direct result of a malicious, highly coordinated attack by his vindictive and completely mentally unstable ex-wife. He painted a picture of me as a jealous, deeply bitter woman who simply could not handle being left behind by a highly successful visionary. He stated that I was a petty freelance bookkeeper who had abused my basic access to his personal passwords to file false fabricated reports with the authorities out of pure, unadulterated spite. He told them I was trying to burn down a billion-dollar technology empire simply because I was angry about a divorce settlement. Derek looked around the room, making desperate eye contact with the wealthy investors. He pointed to Sienna, praising her resilience and claiming the two of them were fighting tirelessly to protect the shareholders from this ridiculous domestic dispute. He proudly announced that to secure the company against my supposed sabotage, the executive team had taken bold, proactive measures early this morning to restructure the capitalization table. He was subtly bragging about his phantom share dilution, genuinely believing his backdoor maneuver had worked, and that he had successfully stolen the company right out from under the majority investor. He smiled, a slick, greasy expression of pure arrogance returning to his sweaty face. He confidently told the room that whoever the anonymous venture capital proxy was, they were going to walk through those doors and find a completely unified, impenetrable corporate fortress. He asked the board for their unwavering trust, promising that by the end of the day, his ex-wife would be behind bars for corporate espionage, and their millions would be perfectly safe. The digital clock on the wall silently ticked over to exactly 9 o'clock. Before the board members could even process Derek's wild accusations, the heavy double glass doors of the boardroom suddenly swung open with a resounding crash. The room fell dead silent. Derek's fake smile completely froze on his face. I walked right through the center of the doorway, dressed in a sharp, immaculate charcoal gray suit. But I did not walk in alone. Flanking me on my right and my left were two heavily armed federal agents, wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests. Marching closely behind us was a team of 5 elite federal forensic auditors, each carrying heavy aluminum briefcases filled with undeniable, mathematically proven criminal evidence. The entire boardroom plunged into a state of absolute paralyzing silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the heavy mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit overhead. The minority shareholders and corporate executives sat completely frozen in their plush leather chairs, their eyes darting wildly between my charcoal gray suit and the heavily armed federal agents standing rigidly by my side. Derek's voice cracked violently as he pointed a trembling finger at me. He screamed at the top of his lungs, demanding to know how I had bypassed the front desk security. He slammed his fist against the wooden podium and ordered the terrified boardroom executives to call building security immediately. He shrieked that his crazy, vindictive ex-wife had hired actors in fake windbreakers to disrupt a confidential corporate meeting, and begged someone to throw me out of the building. The heavy glass doors behind us swung open again. 2 private building security guards rushed into the room, panting heavily, clearly having run all the way from the elevator bank. But before they could even step fully inside, one of the federal agents calmly reached into his jacket. He pulled out a solid gold badge and held it up directly in their line of sight. He advised the private guards in a low, dangerous tone to step back into the hallway immediately unless they wanted to be arrested for obstructing an active federal investigation. The guards took one look at the FBI badge, raised their hands in instant surrender, and backed away, leaving Derek completely isolated and defenseless. I did not say a single word to Derek. I did not even look at him as I walked past the podium. I moved with absolute precision, the sharp click of my heels echoing loudly against the polished hardwood floor. I walked directly to the massive, high-backed leather chair situated at the absolute head of the mahogany table. It was the seat traditionally reserved for the chairman of the board, the seat of ultimate corporate authority. I pulled the heavy chair out, sat down comfortably, and smoothed the fabric of my suit jacket. I folded my hands together and rested them on the polished wood, looking out at the sea of pale, terrified executive faces. Derek spun around his face, turning a dangerous shade of purple. He marched toward me, spittle flying from his lips, as he demanded I get out of his chair. He yelled that I had absolutely no right to be in this building, let alone sitting at the head of his boardroom table. He looked to Sienna for backup, but she was pressed so hard into her chair, she looked like she was trying to merge with the leather. Her eyes were fixed in pure horror on the federal agents now blocking the only exit. I ignored his shouting entirely. I looked directly at the senior legal advisor for the company, a pale man clutching a legal pad at the far end of the table. I spoke in a clear, unwavering voice that commanded the entire room. I officially introduced myself. I told them that my name was Nora, and I was not here as a disgruntled spouse. I announced that I was the fully authorized, legally appointed proxy representative and managing director of the exact anonymous venture capital firm that had recently injected $5 million into the startup. I stated clearly that I held the active voting rights for the 51% majority ownership of this entire corporation. The room erupted into chaotic, panicked whispers. Derek stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw literally dropped, his mouth hanging open in an expression of profound, paralyzing shock. His eyes darted from me to the federal agents, his brain desperately trying to reject the horrifying new reality. He stammered, shaking his head, claiming it was completely impossible. He yelled that he had just authorized 10 million new phantom shares this morning, which meant I had been diluted down to a powerless minority. He looked at Sienna, expecting her to confirm their brilliant backdoor maneuver had worked. I smiled, a cold, unforgiving smile. I calmly informed him that his pathetic attempt to illegally dilute the venture capital shares at 8 o'clock this morning had been instantly flagged and permanently voided by the state corporate master registry. I told him his executive voting rights had been suspended the second the federal hold was placed on his accounts yesterday afternoon. He had absolutely zero power, zero leverage, and zero control over this company. I was the absolute authority in the room, and he was nothing more than a rogue employee awaiting termination. Derek gripped the edge of the table, his legs shaking so badly he looked like he might collapse onto the expensive carpet. I motioned with my hand to the lead federal auditor standing behind me. The auditor stepped forward, placed a heavy aluminum briefcase onto the table, popped the metal latches, and pulled out a thick, heavily bound document. I took the document from his hands. I placed it flat on the mahogany wood and slid it firmly down the center of the long table. The heavy folder glided across the polished surface and stopped exactly in front of Derek's trembling hands. It was a bright, glaring red folder. Printed across the cover in bold black letters were two words that signaled the complete destruction of his empire. Forensic audit. Derek stared down at the bright red folder resting on the mahogany table as if it were a live explosive. The bold black letters spelling out forensic audit seemed to burn directly into his retinas. His hands shook so violently that he could barely pinch the heavy cardboard cover to open it. When he finally managed to flip the folder open, his eyes glazed over the densely packed spreadsheets, the official federal stamps, and the highlighted transaction logs. The senior legal advisor, sitting just inches away at the edge of the table, leaned over and forcefully snatched the folder from Derek's paralyzed grip, rapidly scanning the executive summary. I did not wait for the lawyer to finish reading the devastating conclusions. I tapped the center console on the boardroom table, immediately overriding the room's main presentation system. The massive high-definition screens mounted on every single wall flickered to life. Instead of the usual slick corporate marketing materials, the screens displayed raw lines of code alongside internal company memos and encrypted banking ledgers. I turned my attention to the minority shareholders and the executive board members, speaking in a crisp, unwavering voice that demanded total focus. I told them to look closely at the screens. I asked them to recall the dazzling technological demonstrations Derek had given them over the last 2 years. He had sold them on a revolutionary property management software that supposedly utilized advanced artificial intelligence to predict real estate market trends with unprecedented accuracy. I watched the color rapidly drain from the faces of the wealthy investors as I explained the brutal, undeniable reality. The proprietary software simply did not exist. I revealed that the application they had poured tens of millions of dollars into was nothing more than a superficial wireframe. It was a digital facade, an empty shell with absolutely no functioning back-end architecture. Derek had outsourced the creation of a pretty user interface to a cheap overseas design firm and strictly prohibited his own engineering team from ever looking under the hood. There was no artificial intelligence. There was no revolutionary predictive algorithm. There was only a very expensive, highly polished lie designed to blind wealthy investors. An older gentleman sitting at the far end of the table, one of the original angel investors who had backed the company from day one, slammed his fist down hard against the wood. He demanded to know how the company had been showing such massive, consistent quarterly profits if there was no actual software product being sold to the market. I swiped my finger across my tablet, bringing up the master banking flowcharts on the main screens. I highlighted the massive influxes of venture capital funding the company had received over the past 18 months. I explained the exact mechanics of Derek's amateur corporate fraud. He was not running a real estate technology company at all. He was running a classic, highly leveraged Ponzi scheme. I detailed how whenever a new round of funding came in, Derek would immediately siphon a large percentage of that cash and route it through a complex web of anonymous shell companies. He would then disguise that freshly injected venture capital money as organic software subscription revenue, paying it out as massive dividends to the early investors to keep them completely happy, wealthy, and entirely blind to the truth. I showed the board the exact digital paper trail, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single dollar of profit they thought they had legitimately earned was actually stolen directly from the pockets of the newer investors. Furthermore, I highlighted the millions of dollars Derek had skimmed off the top to fund his own lavish lifestyle. I exposed the company funds used for expensive sports cars, luxury hotel suites, and his secret offshore cryptocurrency accounts. I made sure to casually mention to the room that I had personally ensured those specific offshore accounts were completely drained and safely turned over to the Department of Justice the previous night. The boardroom absolutely exploded. The older angel investor stood up, his face purple with rage, shouting that he was going to see Derek rot in a federal penitentiary. The senior legal advisor threw the red folder back onto the table as if it were on fire, aggressively distancing his law firm from the chief executive officer. Executive board members began shouting over one another, demanding immediate answers, demanding their money back, and cursing Derek for destroying their professional reputations. The noise was deafening, a chaotic chorus of wealthy, powerful people realizing they had been utterly humiliated and robbed by a smooth-talking con artist. Derek shrank back against the glass wall, holding his hands up in a pathetic, trembling attempt to defend himself, but his voice was completely drowned out by the fury of the board. While the entire room was focused on screaming at Derek, I kept my eyes locked on the far corner of the table. Sienna had been sitting perfectly still, the horrifying reality of her situation finally sinking in. As the newly registered holder of the 15% equity block, she was legally the chief financial officer on paper, making her directly responsible for the massive financial fraud currently projected on the walls. Taking advantage of the screaming chaos, Sienna slowly pushed her plush leather chair back. She kept her head down, clutching her expensive designer handbag tightly against her chest. Moving with agonizing slowness, she slipped away from the table, inching her way toward the heavy wooden emergency exit at the very back of the boardroom. Sienna's hand trembled as her manicured fingers wrapped around the brushed steel handle of the heavy wooden emergency exit. She was mere inches from the hallway, mere inches from escaping the catastrophic implosion of the boardroom. She pulled the handle downward, her breath hitching in her throat with desperate anticipation. But before the heavy door could open even a single inch, a massive hand slammed flat against the polished wood directly above her head. The loud smack echoed through the back of the room. Sienna froze completely. She slowly looked up to see one of the towering federal agents glaring down at her, his dark windbreaker blocking her only path to freedom. I raised my right hand, a silent command for the room to settle. The chaotic shouting of the furious board members and minority investors gradually faded into a tense, suffocating silence. Every single head in the massive glass room turned to look at the back door. Sienna was pressed flat against the wood like a trapped animal, her expensive designer handbag clutched defensively against her chest. Her face was ashen, completely drained of the toxic, patronizing confidence she had flaunted just 24 hours earlier. I tapped the glass screen of my encrypted tablet. The massive high-definition monitors covering the boardroom walls instantly shifted away from Derek's empty offshore cryptocurrency wallets. A new document appeared, projected in crisp, undeniable clarity. It was a high-resolution scan of the corporate share transfer agreement. Right there at the bottom, blown up to massive proportions, was Sienna's aggressive looping signature. I directed my voice entirely to her, letting my words ring out clearly in the dead silent room. I reminded her of our lovely little chat at the bistro. I recounted how she had proudly declared herself a modern, high-value woman who was ready to step up and handle the big business. I told the board how she had practically demanded I hand over my 15% equity stake to avoid a messy public scandal. I watched Sienna swallow hard, her eyes darting frantically between the glowing screens and the federal agent blocking her escape. I calmly explained the fatal flaw in her blind ambition. I told the room that she was so desperate to steal my wealth and secure her position of power that she completely failed to read the corporate charter associated with that specific block of shares. I pointed to a highlighted section of the document on the screens. I stated that those 15% shares were legally tethered to the designated corporate title of Chief Financial Officer. By aggressively forcing that transfer and rushing to file the paperwork with the state registry yesterday afternoon, she did not just steal a piece of the company. She legally, officially, and irrevocably assumed total fiduciary responsibility for the entire corporate ledger. Sienna shook her head, whispering a frantic denial, but I cut her off. I delivered the final crushing blow. I told her that she had just voluntarily inherited $12 million of fraudulent tax debt, fabricated vendor invoices, and illegal offshore money laundering. She was now the primary officer of record for the worst financial crimes this company had ever committed. The federal agent standing over her did not hesitate. He grabbed her firmly by the arm, spinning her around and forcing her hands behind her back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting shut echoed loudly in the quiet boardroom. The agent spoke in a deep, booming voice, officially placing her under arrest for massive corporate fraud, tax evasion, and financial racketeering. He began to loudly read her Miranda rights, informing her of her right to remain silent and her right to an attorney, stating that anything she said could and would be used against her in a court of law. The reality of a federal prison sentence finally crushed whatever remained of her arrogant spirit. Her legs simply gave out. She dropped to her knees right there on the expensive boardroom carpet. Her designer handbag spilled open, scattering lipsticks and mints across the floor. She began to sob violently, dark mascara running down her pale cheeks in thick streaks. She begged for mercy, screaming between ragged gasps that Derek had tricked her and that she had absolutely no idea the financial books were fake. While Sienna was having a complete breakdown on the floor, I glanced over at Derek. He was still backed against the far glass wall, watching his mistress get hauled up by her armpits. But the expression on his face was no longer one of absolute paralyzing terror. A sudden, sickening shift had occurred. He slowly stood up a little straighter, adjusting the lapels of his ruined suit. A twisted, desperate wave of relief washed over his sweaty face. He looked from Sienna to the federal auditors, his mind racing to construct a new narrative. He realized that because Sienna had officially registered herself as the chief financial officer, right before the federal hold came down, her name was now the primary signature on the most recent, most damning financial documents. A cold, arrogant smirk began to creep back onto his face. He genuinely believed he had just found his ultimate legal loophole, entirely convinced he was safe because his own signature was no longer on the active tax returns. Derek watched the federal agent pull Sienna up from the carpet. A smug, arrogant grin spread across his face as he adjusted the collar of his ruined suit. He genuinely believed he had just witnessed his own salvation. He stepped away from the glass wall, clearing his throat to draw the attention of the furious board members. He raised his hands in a gesture of false surrender, putting on the performance of a lifetime. He told the room that he was just as shocked and horrified as they were. He boldly claimed that he had placed his total trust in his newly appointed chief financial officer, and she had clearly betrayed them all. He looked directly at the older angel investor, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. He promised that he would fully cooperate with the federal authorities to ensure Sienna faced justice for ruining his beautiful vision. He then turned his attention back to me, his chest puffed out with renewed toxic confidence. He told me that while my little accounting trick had successfully removed a rogue employee, I was still looking at the visionary founder of the company. He confidently stated that since his name was absent from the most recent fraudulent tax filings, he was legally in the clear. He demanded that the board allow him to guide the startup through this difficult transition period, promising he could still salvage the upcoming venture capital funding round. I sat perfectly still in the chairman's seat, letting his desperate, pathetic lies echo through the silent boardroom. I did not interrupt him. I let him dig his grave as deep as possible. When he finally finished his speech, expecting the minority shareholders to rally behind him, I simply shook my head. I told him his delusion was truly spectacular. I explained that while he might try to hide behind Sienna to dodge the immediate tax evasion charges, he fundamentally misunderstood the absolute power I held in this room. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the polished mahogany table. I addressed the entire board, speaking in a highly formal, legally binding tone. I announced that as the authorized proxy holding 51% of the corporate voting rights, I was officially triggering the hostile takeover clause buried deep within the original funding agreement. Derek scoffed, claiming I could not do that without a formal board vote. I smiled coldly and informed him that because I held the absolute majority, the vote was already decided the second I walked through the door. I looked Derek dead in the eye and delivered the verdict. I stated that effective immediately, he was officially terminated from his position as Chief Executive Officer. I told him he was being fired for gross misconduct, financial negligence, and breach of fiduciary duty. Because he was terminated for cause, his employment contract was entirely voided. I made it explicitly clear to the room that he would receive absolutely zero severance pay. There would be no golden parachute. His corporate equity was seized. His access to the building was permanently revoked, and his company-sponsored health insurance was canceled as of this exact second. Derek turned pale, his smug grin completely vanishing. He gripped the edge of the table, stammering that it was his company, his brand, and his legacy. He yelled that he would just start over, take his remaining loyal employees, and build a new platform from scratch. I did not give him a single inch to breathe. I raised my voice, cutting through his frantic rambling. I announced that there would be no company left for him to salvage. As the new controlling entity, my first and only executive order was the immediate and total liquidation of the entire startup. I told the board that we were going to sell off everything to pay back the defrauded investors. We were going to auction off the penthouse lease, the expensive ergonomic office chairs, the glass desks, and every single piece of hardware in the building. I looked at Derek and told him his precious tech empire was going to be sold for scrap metal. The realization that his life's work was being reduced to a discount fire sale completely shattered his mind. He had lost his money, his house, his mistress, and now his ultimate source of narcissistic pride was being erased from existence. Something inside him violently snapped. He let out a raw, guttural scream, completely losing all rational thought. He launched himself forward, vaulting over the corner of the heavy mahogany table. His hands reached out like claws, aiming directly for my throat. He never even made it halfway across the wood. The two federal agents flanking my chair reacted with terrifying speed. The first agent stepped forward and delivered a devastating shove to Derek's chest, knocking him backward off the table. As Derek hit the floor, the second agent lunged, tackling him hard against the expensive carpet. The heavy impact rattled the boardroom windows. The agent drove his knee sharply into Derek's back, pinning him forcefully to the ground, while wrenching his arms behind him. Derek thrashed and screamed like a wild animal, his face pressed painfully into the floor, completely defeated. Derek's cheek was crushed against the dense fibers of the boardroom carpet, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps under the heavy weight of the federal agent's knee. The sharp steel of the handcuffs dug deeply into his wrists, completely neutralizing his violent outburst. Above him, the room was a blur of horrified faces. The minority shareholders and wealthy investors watched in absolute silence as the arrogant chief executive officer was reduced to a pathetic thrashing criminal on the floor of his own headquarters. Just as Derek stopped struggling, letting out a low groan of total defeat, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open one final time. The sharp, authoritative click of dress shoes against the polished hardwood floor cut through the lingering tension. Kendrick walked into the room. He was dressed immaculately in a custom-tailored navy suit carrying his signature dark leather briefcase. His posture was perfectly straight, radiating the quiet, lethal confidence of a man who had just spent the entire night preparing for a legal slaughter. Derek managed to twist his neck just enough to see his brother-in-law approaching. A sudden delusional flicker of hope ignited in Derek's eyes. Despite Kendrick resigning as his corporate counsel the day before, Derek's narcissistic brain instantly convinced him that Kendrick had returned to save the family. He strained against the agent pinning him down, his voice hoarse and desperate. He begged Kendrick to tell the federal agents that this was all a massive misunderstanding. He pleaded with him to file an emergency injunction and get him out of these handcuffs. Kendrick did not rush to help. He walked at a measured, deliberate pace until he was standing directly over Derek. He looked down at this ruined, sweaty man pinned to the floor. The expression on Kendrick's face contained absolutely no warmth, no sympathy, and no familial loyalty. It was a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Kendrick spoke in a deep, resonant voice that carried effortlessly to the back of the boardroom. He told Derek that he was not here to offer legal counsel or to save him from the catastrophic mess he had created. Kendrick stated that he had spent years enduring the subtle disrespect, the arrogant comments, and the overwhelming entitlement of Derek's family. He had watched Derek operate with reckless greed, completely destroying everything and everyone around him. Kendrick unlatched his heavy leather briefcase. The brass locks clicked loudly in the quiet room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, professionally bound stack of legal documents. He looked down at Derek and officially announced the true reason for his visit. He told Derek that he was here representing two brand new clients, Beatrice and Claire. Derek's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. He stopped pulling against the handcuffs, the horrible reality of the situation freezing the blood in his veins. Kendrick continued, his voice cold and clinical. He explained that he was officially serving Derek with a massive civil lawsuit on behalf of his own mother and sister. The charges included egregious financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, grand larceny, and felony elder abuse. Kendrick knelt down on one knee, bringing his face dangerously close to Derek's. He lowered his voice just enough so that only Derek and the surrounding agents could hear the venom in his words. He reminded Derek of the massive wire transfer he had manipulated out of Beatrice the day before. He stated that because Derek had taken an old woman's entire retirement pension under the false pretense of securing a criminal defense attorney, and instead used those exact funds to purchase a luxury sports car for his mistress, he had committed a textbook case of financial elder abuse. Since Derek's hands were securely restrained behind his back, Kendrick simply dropped the thick stack of legal papers right onto the carpet inches from Derek's face. Kendrick stood back up, smoothing his tie. He delivered his final devastating promise. He told Derek that he personally knew every single financial loophole, every hidden ledger, and every dirty secret of this company, because Derek had foolishly shown them to him. Kendrick swore that he would aggressively hunt down whatever pennies the federal government did not seize. He promised to garnish any future wages Derek might ever earn and ensure he spent the rest of his miserable life drowning in civil debt. Kendrick stepped back, leaving Derek to face the federal justice system with absolutely nothing but a court-appointed public defender. The federal agents grabbed Derek by the shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. His tailored suit was torn, his tie was ripped off, and his face was smeared with dust from the floor. He looked around the room, realizing the absolute totality of his destruction. His company was being liquidated, his massive fortune was gone. Sienna was already in custody, and his own family had just legally declared war on him. The agents pushed him forward, marching him aggressively toward the boardroom exit. As they dragged him through the heavy glass doors and down the long corporate hallway, Derek finally broke. He threw his head back and screamed my name. The sound was a horrific, agonizing wail of pure defeat that echoed off the glass walls. He was hauled into the elevator in handcuffs, screaming until the doors slid shut, completely erased from the empire he thought he owned. 6 months later, the bright morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of my kitchen, illuminating the steam rising from my ceramic coffee mug. I stood casually by the marble island, the exact same spot where Derek had arrogantly slammed those divorce papers down so many months ago. The house was perfectly quiet, save for the low, measured voice of the local news anchor broadcasting from the flat-screen television mounted on the wall. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee and watched the inevitable, satisfying conclusion of the empire my ex-husband had tried to build on a foundation of lies. The news anchor looked gravely into the camera, detailing the final chapter of the most high-profile corporate fraud case the city had seen in a decade. The screen cut to footage from outside the federal courthouse. Derek was being escorted down the concrete steps by two armed U.S. Marshals. He looked absolutely unrecognizable. His expensive tailored suits and arrogant swagger were completely gone, replaced by a drab, oversized khaki prison uniform. His face was pale, his hair was thinning, and his shoulders were slumped in total defeat. The reporter announced that the judge had shown absolutely no leniency. Because the forensic evidence I had provided was so overwhelming and mathematically undeniable, the trial had been remarkably swift. Derek was officially sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for wire fraud, embezzlement, and operating a massive corporate Ponzi scheme. The court had also ordered the total liquidation of his remaining personal assets to partially restitute the minority shareholders he had so brutally defrauded. He was going to spend the next decade and a half locked in a tiny concrete cell, completely stripped of the wealth and power he had valued above all else. The broadcast then shifted to Sienna. She was shown walking out of the same courthouse, her face hidden behind her hands, as camera flashes erupted around her. The high-value modern woman persona she had so proudly flaunted was entirely shattered. The news anchor reported that despite her desperate attempts to plea bargain and blame Derek for the entire operation, the federal prosecutors held firm. The signature she had so eagerly scribbled onto that share transfer agreement in the bistro had legally bound her to the criminal enterprise. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for tax evasion and corporate racketeering. She had demanded a seat at the executive table, and the justice system had graciously given her exactly what she asked for. I muted the television, turning my attention away from the news. While Derek and Sienna were adjusting to their new lives behind bars, Beatrice was facing a completely different kind of prison. Through the complex network of civil lawsuits Kendrick had relentlessly filed on behalf of the defrauded family members, Beatrice had lost everything. I knew from the court filings that she had been forced to move out of her luxurious, sprawling estate. She now lived in a tiny, run-down one-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. There were no more country club luncheons, no more designer clothes, and no more elite social circles to impress. Her days were spent entirely alone in a cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a dripping faucet, surviving on a meager Social Security check because she had foolishly liquidated her massive pension for a son who had robbed her blind. Claire completely blamed Beatrice for pushing Kendrick away and destroying their family dynamic. Claire had changed her phone number, blocked her mother on every conceivable platform, and refused to speak a single word to the woman who had enabled Derek's toxic behavior for his entire life. Beatrice was finally forced to sit in the suffocating silence of her own consequences. I walked over to the heavy oak front door of my home. The splintered wood from Derek's violent midnight attack had been completely replaced with a beautiful reinforced custom frame. I ran my hand over the smooth wood, feeling a profound sense of absolute security. This house did not belong to a controlling husband. It belonged entirely to the private trust I had built with my own brilliance and hard work. I returned to the kitchen island and opened my encrypted laptop. I logged into my highly secure federal communications portal. Waiting in my inbox was a priority message from the Department of Justice. It was a brand new, multi-million-dollar independent consulting contract. The federal government had been so deeply impressed by my surgical takedown of Derek's syndicate that they wanted me to lead a massive task force tracking international money laundering cartels. I read through the generous terms, a genuine smile spreading across my face. I moved the cursor digitally, signed the contract with a single keystroke, and closed the laptop with a satisfying click. I grabbed my tailored cashmere coat and walked out the front door into the crisp morning air. A sleek black town car was already idling at the edge of my driveway, the driver politely holding the door open for me. I stepped into the back seat, wealthy, respected, and completely untouchable. The car pulled away from the curb, driving smoothly into a bright and limitless future. The saga of Nora and Derek serves as a powerful reminder that true strength does not need to announce itself. Derek's catastrophic downfall was not merely the result of a federal investigation. It was the direct consequence of his own blinding arrogance. He mistook his wife's silence for submission and her calm demeanor for weakness. In today's fast-paced world, people often equate loud, boastful behavior with absolute power and success. However, this story brilliantly illustrates that the most formidable individuals are frequently the ones quietly observing, analyzing, and building their fortress, while others are busy showing off. Nora's meticulous dismantling of a fraudulent tech empire highlights the incredible value of financial literacy, emotional control, and strategic patience. When confronted with cruelty and betrayal from a spouse, human instinct usually demands an immediate emotional reaction. Nora chose a completely different path. She weaponized her intellect and allowed her husband's massive ego to dig his own grave. By constantly assuming he was the smartest person in the room, Derek entirely blinded himself to the brilliant forensic accountant sitting right across his kitchen island. He severely underestimated her capabilities simply because she did not fit his superficial, arrogant definition of a successful professional. This offers a profound lesson in human dynamics. Never assume someone lacks intelligence, power, or capability just because they choose not to flaunt it. Arrogance creates massive blind spots, whereas quiet competence and meticulous preparation build an untouchable armor. When we focus on authentic personal growth and financial independence, rather than seeking shallow validation or trying to dominate others, we protect ourselves from the devastating traps that snare the ego-driven. Evaluate the relationships and power dynamics in your own life today, and take one concrete step toward building your own undeniable financial independence.